He leaned across the table, close enough that I could smell the cologne my daughter had bought him for Christmas, and he said it like he was telling me the weather, like it was nothing, like I was nothing. My parents feel it would be better if you watch the ceremony online. They're hosting a small, intimate gathering, and they want to keep it to immediate family only. I remember the way the candle on the table flickered. I remember the sound of forks against plates at the other tables around us. I remember smiling, not because I felt like smiling, but because I had learned, in 63 years of living, that the moment you let someone see how badly they've hurt you, you've already lost. My daughter was in the washroom. She had no idea what had just been said to me. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, set it back down, and said, "I see." He nodded, like he was relieved, like the hard part was over. It had barely started. My name is not important to this story. What is important is that I built something. After my husband passed 11 years ago, I was 52 years old, with a bookkeeping background, a house in Oakville that was half paid off, and a daughter who was 24 and had just graduated from the University of Guelph with a business degree. What I also had was a small tax preparation office that Gerald and I had run together out of a strip mall on Kerr Street. It was modest. 3 desks, 2 printers, a coffee machine that always needed descaling. I did not let grief stop me. I could not afford to. Over the next several years, I expanded. One office became 2. I brought in a partner, a woman I trusted, and we grew the business carefully, deliberately, the way you do when you know what it costs to lose something. By the time my daughter was 30, we had 4 offices across the Greater Toronto Area, a staff of 17, and a reputation that had taken me a decade to build. My daughter had been working with me since she graduated. She knew the business the way she knew her own name. She had my husband's mind for numbers and my stubbornness about quality. She was the one who convinced me to expand to Mississauga. She was right about that, and she was right about most things. She met him at a conference in Ottawa, corporate tax seminar 2 days February. He was charming in the way that men at conferences are charming. Confident, well-dressed, full of easy conversation. He worked in finance for a mid-sized company in Brampton, made decent money, seemed to have his head on straight. When she introduced him to me, I shook his hand and tried to see him the way she did. I wanted to like him. I genuinely wanted that. There were small things at first, so small I told myself I was imagining them. He started coming to Sunday dinners and sitting at the head of the table, the chair that had been Gerald's. I never said anything. I moved my own seat quietly and let it go. He started talking over my daughter at meals, finishing her sentences, not in an affectionate way, but in a way that slowly, steadily redirected the conversation toward himself. I noticed she didn't seem to, or maybe she had already started adjusting to it without realizing. He got a key to her condo early on, which was her decision and none of my business. But then he got a key to my office on Kerr Street because he had driven her to work one morning and she had left something inside. She'd asked me if it was all right. I said yes. He never returned the key, and neither of them mentioned it again. He started referring to the business in ways that put himself inside it. When we eventually bring on another accountant, the way things are structured, you'd want to think about succession planning soon. Then soon, as though the timeline was already decided. I caught these things. I wrote them down actually, not because I knew exactly what to do with them, but because something in me understood that details matter when you can't yet see the whole picture. When he proposed, my daughter was radiant. I held her and told her I was happy for her because I was. Complicated feelings and uncomplicated love can exist in the same moment. I was happy for her, and I was watching him at the same time. The engagement changed things. He started coming to the office more. First, just to pick her up. Then, to sit in on meetings. Just to understand the business better, since we'll be family. She thought it was sweet. I thought it was something else. But I could not name it cleanly yet. He would ask questions that sounded like curiosity but landed like something sharper. What percentage of our clients were on annual retainer? Who held signing authority on the business accounts? Did I have a shareholders agreement with my partner, or was it informal? He asked these things with a relaxed smile, casual, over coffee in the small back kitchen, and every time I answered briefly and changed the subject. One afternoon in October, about 4 months before the wedding, I came into the office early and found him at my desk. He was not on the computer, he was just sitting there in my chair, looking at some papers that were face down on the desk surface. When he saw me, he stood up easily, not startled, not embarrassed, just accommodating, like someone shifting to make room. "Morning," he said. "Diane forgot her phone charger. She asked me to grab it." The charger was on the opposite side of the room. I smiled and said, "Of course." That evening, I called a locksmith. The wedding planning had been going on for months, and I had been involved at a comfortable distance. My daughter consulted me on things she wanted my opinion on, and I gave it, and otherwise, I let her lead. I had offered to contribute financially, which is what you do when you have the means. She accepted gratefully. It was not a transaction, it was a mother helping her daughter. His parents lived in Kelowna. I had met them once, briefly, at a dinner in the summer. His mother was polished in a careful way, the kind of woman who compliments your home by looking around it in a manner that makes you feel appraised. His father was quieter, asked a lot of questions about the business, said things like impressive in a tone that meant something more complicated than the word itself. I was pleasant. So were they. We were all very pleasant. So when he leaned across the dinner table that November evening in Oakville and told me his parents wanted me to watch my daughter's wedding on a live stream, I was not entirely surprised. I was hurt, but I was not surprised. I had driven to the restaurant myself. My daughter had arrived separately, directly from the office. We were celebrating some small anniversary of theirs, I think, or perhaps it was just a dinner. I no longer remember the reason, only the moment. He said what he said while she was in the washroom. I smiled and said, "I see." He said, "They're very particular about atmosphere. It's not personal." I said, "Of course." He said, "I knew you'd understand. You're very reasonable. That's one of the things I've always appreciated about you." I nodded, picked up the menu, and looked at the pasta options like this was a conversation about nothing. When my daughter came back to the table, she sat down and looked at the two of us, and she must have noticed something in the air because she said, "Everything okay?" And I said, "Wonderful." I was just telling him I'd love the salmon. I did not tell her that night. I drove home through the November dark, parked in my garage, sat in the car for a while. I thought about Gerald. I thought about what he would have done. He would have been angry in a quiet way that scared people more than shouting. He would have said, "Wait, watch, then move." I did not tell my daughter the next day either. I waited 10 days. In those 10 days, I did 3 things. The first thing was a conversation with my accountant and my lawyer, two people who had known me since Gerald was alive and who I trusted completely. I asked them to review my current business structure, specifically around ownership shares, signing authorities, and what would happen legally if a spouse of a co-owner attempted to assert rights over business assets. My lawyer was careful and thorough, and by the end of the week, I had moved certain documents into a structure that was, in his words, quite resistant to outside claims. The second thing was a conversation with my business partner, the woman I had built this with. I told her what had happened at dinner. She is not a woman given to dramatics, which is why I trust her. She listened, and when I finished, she said, "You've been watching this longer than you've been saying." I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Just be ready." The third thing was that I asked my daughter to come for dinner on a Sunday, just the two of us. She came. I made the soup she likes, the butternut squash one with the smoked paprika. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table we had been sitting at together since she was in a high chair, and I told her everything. I told her about what he had said at the restaurant. I told her about walking into the office and finding him in my chair. I told her about the questions about signing authority and shareholders' agreements. I told her about the charger that was on the wrong side of the room. I told her about the key that had never been returned. And then I opened a drawer and put a new key on the table and told her the locks had been changed. She was quiet for a long time. I did not fill the silence. I let her have it. Finally, she said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said, "Because I wanted to be sure, and because I needed you to hear this from me with a clear head, not in the heat of a moment at a restaurant." She said, "He told you I couldn't come to my own mother's, to the wedding he's planning in my city, with money partly from my mother, and I can watch it on a screen." I said, "That is what he said, yes." She looked at her soup. She said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking that I want you to be happy, and I'm thinking that I want you to be safe, and I'm thinking that a man who decides where your mother belongs before you've even signed a marriage certificate is showing you exactly what he will decide next." She nodded very slowly. Then she said, "I need a few days." I said, "Take what you need." She called me on the Wednesday. She said, "I've been going through things. I found some emails." I waited. She said, "He's been corresponding with a corporate lawyer in Hamilton, the kind that handles business restructuring, about a company that sounds exactly like ours." I said, "When did it start?" She said, 7 months ago." I said nothing for a moment. 7 months ago was before the engagement ring, before the proposal that made her radiant. She said, "Mom." I said, "I'm here." She said, "I need you to come to the office tomorrow morning before he gets there." I said, "I'll be there at 7." She was already there when I arrived. She had printed the emails. She had them in a folder. She was still in her coat when I walked in. Her face was the face of someone who has slept badly and worked hard while everyone else was asleep. We sat across from each other in the boardroom, the small one off the main hallway, the one with Gerald's old photograph on the wall, and she walked me through it. He had been in contact with the lawyer since spring. The emails discussed, in detail, what the company's structure would look like after a marriage, particularly if the controlling family member, that was how they referred to me, could be incentivized to transition out or step back from active roles. There was a reference to her being more receptive to changes after the wedding than before. There was a discussion about Kelowna and whether it made sense to shift operations westward. There was nothing illegal in the emails, just a careful, early blueprint for a future he had been designing without her knowledge, in a company built by her mother's hands. She closed the folder. She said, "I have a call with HR at 9, and then I have a call with our lawyer at 10. I said, "Okay." She said, "I'm going to end the engagement today." I said, "Okay." She said, "And his employment?" I said, "Yes." She looked at me and said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I want to be sure you're all right." She said, "I will be, not today, but I will be." He arrived at 9:15. She met him in the hallway. I stayed in the boardroom and did not listen, because it was her conversation to have, not mine. I could hear the tone of things, her voice, measured and clear, and his voice, which shifted through several registers I recognized, disbelief, then justification. Then a particular kind of quiet that men use when they realize the ground has changed under them. She came back into the boardroom 40 minutes later. She sat down. She said, "He said his parents were right about me, that I was too close to you, that you had too much influence." I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I said, then find yourself a new fiancé and a new employer and good luck with both." She said it without drama, the way you say something you have been carrying for a while and have finally set down. His parents drove in from Pearson 2 days later. I do not know whether he called them or whether they came on their own, but they arrived at the office mid-morning on a Thursday. He was not with them. I have no idea how they got into the building. I suspect someone held the door. My daughter was in the meeting. I was at my desk. His mother asked to speak to me privately. His father stood slightly behind her with his arms crossed. She said that this had gotten out of hand. She said that her son was a good man and that my daughter had made a rash decision. She said that our business would be better positioned with someone like her son in a formal advisory role. She actually said that. Better positioned. She said it the way you say something you have been rehearsing. I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Your son told me while my daughter was out of the room that I was not welcome at her wedding. He presented it as your decision. I want you to know that I did not make a scene. I did not cry. I went home and I thought carefully about what that told me. And what it told me was this: a man who is comfortable delivering that kind of message to a woman's mother, alone at a dinner table, has already decided what that woman's family is worth. I took that information and I used it. That is all." She opened her mouth. I continued. I said, "I think you should go. And I think if your son would like a reference, he should ask someone else." His father said something under his breath. I did not respond to that. My daughter had come out of her meeting and was standing in the hallway. She had heard some of it. She walked to the front door and opened it and said, "I'll see you out." They went. The door closed. My daughter stood in the hallway for a moment, and then she looked at me and started to laugh. Not the relieved kind, not the nervous kind, the kind of laugh that comes when something has finally resolved, and the absurdity of how long it took hits you all at once. I laughed too. We stood in my office hallway in the middle of a Thursday morning and laughed until our eyes were wet. Then she said, "I have a 2 o'clock." I said, "I know, I'll make tea." The wedding venue deposit was refundable. She had had the sense to book with a cancellation clause, which I had quietly advised without making it a thing. The invitations had not yet been mailed. The dress could be returned. These things are never small, but they were smaller than they could have been. She took a week off in January. She went to visit a friend in Victoria and came back with color in her face and a clearer set of shoulders. She did not talk about him much. She talked about what she wanted to do with the Mississauga location, about the new CRA guidelines that were going to affect a chunk of our client base, about whether she wanted to take a course she'd been putting off. She talked about the future, not as something she was afraid of, but as something that was hers again. I think about that dinner in November sometimes. The candle on the table. The way he said it so lightly, like I was a small scheduling inconvenience. The way I smiled and picked up my water glass and said, "I see. I am 63 years old. I have buried a husband. I have run a business through a recession and a pandemic and the particular grinding weight of being a woman who has to prove things twice. I have learned that the most powerful thing you can sometimes do is let someone believe they have won and then go home and get to work." He thought he was managing me. He was not managing me. He was showing me exactly who he was. I saw. I keep coming back to that candle on the table. The way it flickered while he said what he said, so casually, like I was a footnote in my own daughter's life. I've thought about that moment more than I expected to. Not with anger, is a fire that burns through the wrong things, but with a kind of steady recognition. What he revealed in that moment wasn't just rudeness, it was a blueprint, and the only question was whether I would read it clearly or let myself be blinded by wanting things to be fine. I think the hardest thing, when someone shows you who they are, is resisting the urge to rewrite what you just saw. We do it out of love, or out of hope, or because the alternative requires so much more of us. I could have smiled at that dinner and driven home and told myself it was nerves before a wedding, or a miscommunication, or something that would smooth itself out. A part of me wanted to believe that, but another part, the part that has been through enough to know the difference between a rough edge and a rotten foundation, wrote it down instead. Kept watching, kept thinking. That is not a small thing. It takes a particular kind of honesty to look at a situation you wish were different and see it as it actually is. What my daughter did took something different. It took courage of a specific kind, not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that moves quietly and deliberately when everything in you wants to hesitate. She could have found those emails and spent weeks doubting herself, making excuses, weighing what she would lose. Instead, she made a folder, called her lawyer, and walked into that building knowing exactly what needed to happen. I have raised her for 34 years, and I have never been more certain that she was going to be all right than I was in that moment. Not because she was angry, because she was clear. What he lacked, and I think this is worth saying plainly, was the basic decency of seeing other people as fully real. His parents, too. The way his mother stood in my office and said the word positioned, like I was an obstacle in a business plan rather than a human being who had built something from grief and stubbornness and 20 years of early mornings. There is a cost to moving through the world that way. Not a divine punishment, not karma in any mystical sense, just the ordinary, reliable consequence of treating people as means rather than ends. People notice. People remember. People make folders. I turned 63 in October. I've learned that how you carry yourself through hard things is not separate from who you become. It is exactly how you become it. The restraint I practiced at that dinner table, the patience of 10 days, the careful conversations with people I trusted, none of that was passivity. It was the accumulation of every difficult thing I had ever chosen to handle with my head as well as my heart. Strength without integrity collapses inward. Intelligence without character just becomes cleverness in service of the wrong things. What holds is the combination, knowing what is right, knowing how to think, and having the will to act when it counts. My daughter has all three. I saw it that Thursday morning in the boardroom, her coat still on, the folder on the table between us, her face tired and decided. She didn't need me to tell her what to do. She already knew. That is the only thing, in the end, that I wanted to build.